Imagine standing in absolute darkness. The air is thick, stale, and suffocating. Above you, somewhere far beyond reach, is the world you once knew: sunlight, freedom, life itself. But down here, in this stone chamber carved deep into the earth, there is only silence and waiting. Waiting for a fate you know is inevitable. This isn't a medieval dungeon or a modern penitentiary. This is something far older, something that predates everything we think we know about imprisonment and punishment. And the story of how humanity created the very first prison is darker, stranger, and more revealing than you might imagine. For thousands of years, civilizations dealt with criminals in ways that seem almost unthinkable today. Execution, exile, mutilation, slavery. These were the tools of ancient justice. The idea of locking someone away, of removing them from society while keeping them alive, of creating a space specifically designed to hold human beings against their will. This was not always the obvious solution it seems today. So when did it begin? Where did the first true prison exist? And what does its creation tell us about the moment when humanity fundamentally changed how it viewed crime, punishment, and the value of human life itself? The answer takes us to a civilization that built the foundations of Western law, philosophy, and democracy. But it also takes us to a place of unimaginable cruelty. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand the world's first prison, we need to understand how ancient societies thought about crime and punishment. In most early civilizations, the concept of imprisonment as punishment simply didn't exist. If you committed a crime in ancient Babylon, ancient Egypt, or among the early Hebrew tribes, you faced immediate and often brutal consequences. Theft might cost you a hand. Murder would cost you your life. Exile removed you permanently from your community. The idea of holding someone in a cell for weeks, months, or years wasn't part of the equation. Why? Because imprisonment was expensive and impractical. It required guards, buildings, food for prisoners, and administrative oversight. For societies operating on tight resources, this made no economic sense. Far simpler to execute, enslave, or banish those who broke the law. Justice was swift, physical, and final. But there was one civilization that began to think differently. Ancient Athens, at the height of its golden age in the 5th century before Christ, was revolutionizing nearly every aspect of human society. Democracy was being born. Philosophy was flourishing. Theater, architecture, mathematics, and medicine were reaching heights that would influence humanity for millennia. And quietly, almost without anyone realizing its significance, Athens was also creating something new in the realm of justice, a building designed specifically to hold people who had been accused of crimes, to keep them alive and contained while their fate was decided. This building was called the Desmoterion, and it may very well have been the world's first true prison. The Desmoterion wasn't located in some remote location or hidden from public view. It stood in the heart of Athens, near the Agora, the bustling marketplace and civic center where democracy itself was practiced. Citizens walked past it every day. They knew what it was. They knew who was inside. And that was precisely the point. The prison wasn't just a practical solution to a logistical problem. It was a statement about Athenian values, about the rule of law, and about the belief that even the accused deserved a measure of dignity that previous civilizations hadn't always granted. But here's where the story becomes more complex. The Desmoterion wasn't designed to punish. That's a crucial distinction. It was designed to hold people temporarily, those awaiting trial, those who couldn't pay debts, those whose cases were being deliberated by the courts. Punishment in Athens still often meant execution, exile, or fines. The prison itself was a waiting room for justice, not justice itself, until it became something else entirely. The transformation happened gradually. almost imperceptibly. As Athenian democracy matured, so did its legal system. Trials became more elaborate. Cases took longer to resolve. Some prisoners waited weeks, even months, for their day before the jury. And during that time, something unexpected occurred. The experience of imprisonment itself, the isolation, the loss of freedom, the psychological weight of confinement, began to be recognized as its own form of suffering. The authorities started to realize that holding someone in the Desmoterion wasn't just a neutral act of custody, it was a punishment in its own right. This was a revolutionary idea. It suggested that freedom itself had measurable value, that taking it away, even temporarily, constituted a penalty severe enough to serve as deterrent and retribution. Previous civilizations had understood that exile removed someone from their community, but imprisonment was different. It kept you close, visible, yet completely powerless. It was a punishment that operated on the mind as much as the body. The man who would make the Desmoterion famous, or perhaps infamous, wasn't a criminal in the traditional sense. He was arguably the most important philosopher who ever lived. His name was Socrates. In 399 before Christ, Socrates was 70 years old. For decades, he had wandered the streets and marketplaces of Athens, engaging anyone who would listen in philosophical dialogue. He questioned everything: morality, justice, knowledge, virtue. He challenged the assumptions of politicians, poets, and craftsmen, often revealing the limitations of their understanding through his relentless questioning. He became beloved by some, especially the young men who followed him and learned his methods. But he also made powerful enemies. The charges brought against Socrates were vague yet damning: corrupting the youth and impiety, failing to honor the gods of Athens, and introducing new deities. These accusations were politically motivated, driven by men who saw Socrates as a threat to social order and traditional values. But in democratic Athens, charges required a trial, and a trial required holding the accused until the jury could convene. So Socrates was taken to the Desmoterion. Imagine the scene. The greatest mind in Athens, a man who had spent his entire life in pursuit of truth and wisdom, now confined to a small stone cell. He could have fled. Friends offered to help him escape. Bribery of guards was not uncommon. But Socrates refused. To run would be to reject the very laws and social contract he had spent his life defending. If Athens had become corrupt enough to convict him unjustly, then accepting that injustice was the final lesson he could teach. The trial proceeded. A jury of 500 Athenian citizens heard the case. Socrates defended himself, but in his characteristic way, by questioning, by challenging, by refusing to beg for mercy or pander to emotion. He spoke the truth as he saw it, even when that truth infuriated his accusers. The verdict came down: guilty. The punishment: death. But there was a delay. Religious festivals prevented immediate execution, so Socrates returned to the Desmoterion, not as a man awaiting trial, but as a condemned prisoner awaiting death. For 30 days, he remained in that cell. And during those 30 days, something extraordinary happened. His students came to visit. His friends gathered around him. And in that prison cell, Socrates continued teaching. He discussed immortality, virtue, and the nature of the soul. He explored what it meant to live a good life and die a good death. Those conversations, recorded by his student Plato, became some of the most influential philosophical texts in human history, the dialogues Phaedo and Crito, among others. The prison cell became a classroom. The condemned man became immortal through his words. When the day of execution finally arrived, Socrates faced it with calmness that astonished everyone present. He drank the hemlock poison, lay down, and waited for the paralysis to take him. His last words, according to Plato, were a reminder to a friend to repay a debt, a small offering owed to the god of healing, Asclepius. Even in death, Socrates honored his obligations. The Desmoterion had held many prisoners before Socrates and would hold many after. But his imprisonment transformed how people thought about the place. It wasn't just a holding cell anymore. It was where one of humanity's greatest minds spent his final days, teaching until the very end. The prison became a symbol of both the worst impulses of democratic society and the highest virtues of individual conscience. But there's a twist to this story, one that changes everything we think we know about the world's first prison. For centuries, historians accepted that the Desmoterion was indeed the world's first true prison. Ancient texts mentioned it. Plato's dialogues described it. Scholars mapped its approximate location near the Athenian agora. But here's the problem. No one could find it. Archaeological excavations in Athens uncovered temples, theaters, marketplaces, homes, and workshops. But the Desmoterion itself remained elusive. Was it destroyed so completely that nothing remained, or had historians been looking in the wrong place? Then, in 1895, archaeologists made a discovery. Beneath the foundations of later buildings, they found a small structure with thick walls and evidence of heavy security. Could this be the famous prison? The location seemed right, close to the agora, consistent with ancient descriptions. Excitement built in the academic community. But as further analysis continued, doubts emerged. The building's age was uncertain. Its purpose was unclear. Some scholars argued it was a prison. Others suggested it might have been a warehouse, a treasury, or even a private residence with a reinforced basement. The debate continues to this day. We have ancient texts that clearly describe the Desmoterion and its function. We have philosophical dialogues that take place within its walls. But we don't have definitive archaeological proof of its exact location or structure. This raises a fascinating question. How much of what we know about the world's first prison is historical fact, and how much is literary construction? Some historians now argue that we've been asking the wrong question. Perhaps the Desmoterion wasn't the world's first prison at all. Perhaps older civilizations had similar structures that simply weren't recorded in texts that survived. The ancient Egyptians, for instance, had words for prison and imprisonment in their hieroglyphic texts. The Code of Hammurabi from ancient Babylon, dating back to 1750 before Christ, mentions holding prisoners. Were these merely temporary holding cells, or were they something more? We may never know for certain, but here's what we do know. Athens was the first civilization to systematically integrate imprisonment into its legal system as a recognized component of justice. Whether the Desmoterion was literally the first prison building ever constructed matters less than what it represented, a fundamental shift in how humans thought about crime, punishment, and the value of time itself. Think about it. In a world where execution, mutilation, and exile were the norm, choosing to remove someone's freedom while preserving their life was radical. It required believing that time, days, weeks, months of a person's existence, had worth. That taking that time away was punishment enough for certain offenses. That keeping someone alive in confinement could serve society's interests better than killing them or driving them away. This philosophy would eventually spread throughout the ancient world. The Romans adopted and expanded the concept, creating more sophisticated prison systems. Medieval Europe built dungeons and towers. Modern nations constructed the massive penitentiary systems we know today, with all their complexities, controversies, and failures. But it all traces back to that small building in ancient Athens, where prisoners waited for trial, and where one man chose to use his confinement to teach the world about virtue, courage, and the examined life. The legacy of the Desmoterion extends far beyond its physical walls. It represents the moment when humanity decided that justice could be measured not just in blood or exile, but in time. That punishment could be psychological as well as physical. That even the accused, even the guilty, retained enough human dignity to deserve something other than immediate execution or mutilation. Of course, we also have to acknowledge the darker aspects of this legacy. The history of imprisonment from Athens to the present day is filled with cruelty, injustice, and suffering. Prisons have been used to silence dissidents, warehouse the poor, and perpetuate racial and social inequalities. The same system that kept Socrates alive long enough to teach his final lessons has also condemned millions to unjust suffering in dungeons, jails, and penitentiaries across the centuries. The Athenians themselves recognized this tension. They knew that their legal system, for all its democratic innovations, could be manipulated and corrupted. The trial of Socrates proved that. A jury of 500 citizens, supposedly representing the wisdom of the people, condemned an innocent man to death for political reasons. The prison held him not because justice demanded it, but because power did. Yet that same prison gave Socrates the time and space to articulate ideas that would outlive Athens itself, outlive the Roman Empire, outlive medieval kingdoms, and reach us today across more than 2,000 years. In that stone cell, he argued that the soul is immortal, that virtue is its own reward, that an unexamined life is not worth living. Would those words have had the same power if he'd spoken them anywhere else? Or did the context of imprisonment, a philosopher in chains, a teacher in a cage, give them a weight and resonance they wouldn't otherwise possess? The philosophers who came after Socrates certainly thought so. They returned again and again to the image of the imprisoned sage, the man who remained free in his mind, even when his body was confined. That image would inspire countless others facing unjust imprisonment throughout history, from early Christian martyrs in Roman prisons to political prisoners in modern dictatorships. The Desmoterion, whether we can locate its ruins or not, became a symbol that transcended its physical reality. Today, when we think about prisons, we rarely consider their origins. We debate their effectiveness, their costs, their role in society, their impact on communities. We argue about sentencing, rehabilitation, and recidivism. But we seldom ask, why do we imprison people at all? What was the original purpose? What were the first people who built prisons trying to achieve? The answer, if Athens provides any guide, is complex. The first prison wasn't built to be cruel, though it could be used cruelly. It wasn't built to warehouse criminals, though it could serve that function. It was built to give justice time to deliberate, time to investigate, time to ensure that irreversible punishments like execution weren't carried out hastily or unjustly. In that sense, the prison was an expression of doubt, of uncertainty, of the recognition that human judgment is fallible and requires careful consideration. That ancient Athenians, living more than 2,000 years ago, understood this principle while creating the foundations of democracy is remarkable. That they also understood how easily the system could be corrupted, as the trial of Socrates demonstrated, is equally important. The world's first prison, then, teaches us something profound. It shows us that humanity's greatest innovations, democracy, philosophy, justice, are always imperfect. They can be used for good or ill. They reflect both our highest aspirations and our deepest flaws. The same society that gave the world Socrates also killed him. The same legal system that pioneered fair trials also convicted an innocent man. The same prison that allowed a condemned philosopher to teach his final lessons also held him captive until the state could end his life. Perhaps that's the real lesson of the Desmoterion. Not that we created prisons, but that we created them for complex, sometimes contradictory reasons, and that we've been struggling with those contradictions ever since. Every modern debate about criminal justice, about imprisonment and punishment, about how society should deal with those who break its rules, all of it echoes back to that small building in ancient Athens where the first prisoners waited in darkness, wondering what judgment awaited them in the light above. And somewhere in that darkness, if we listen carefully enough, we can still hear an old man's voice, asking questions, teaching students, examining life until his very last breath, proving that even walls and chains cannot truly imprison a free mind.